Once upon a time, in a world bursting with tales untold, there was a place where stories come to life, a place where the extraordinary became the everyday, and where every word carried you deeper into the unknown. This was not an ordinary place. It was a sanctuary for storytellers, dreamers, and wanderers alike. Welcome to All Things Storybound, where imagination has no limits and every tale takes you on an unforgettable journey. Here we unravel mysteries, delve into the fantastic, and explore the depths of the human heart. So whether you seek a gripping twist, a heartwarming revelation, or a world unlike any you've ever known, you're in the right place. Sit back, open your mind, and let us take you beyond the bounds of reality. Let the story begin.
Chapter 1.
It was eerily silent outside, the kind of silence that you feel deep in your bones, in your soul. No birds were singing, no crickets chirping, no dogs barking. I probably could have heard a leaf hit the ground if there was a hint of wind. But that was how it needed to be right now, how it had to be. With one last lingering glance inside my childhood home, I swung my backpack over my shoulders, picked up my small duffel bag along with it, and carefully began holstering my pistol, shrugging my rifle over my other shoulder, and I already had probably 5 or 6 knives along my belt and hidden on my person. The thing about chaos is that it creates 2 different kinds of people: the people who step up and the people who step out. In this world, if you step out, you're dead. So you learn to step up to survive. I carefully stepped out into the wooden porch, avoiding the creaky planks, and gingerly pulled the door closed behind me. Not that closing it mattered, it was more symbolic than anything else, but it had to be done. The steps down thankfully didn't make any noise or draw attention. I had been careful to leave while it was clear, but there was always a risk. I followed the sidewalk for miles at a steady pace, staying in the shadows with my hand on the handle of my knife at the whisper of a sound. A limb breaking, the wind picking up in the trees, a trash bag flapping. The world had changed so quickly. It only took months for nature to begin to reclaim the city. Grass overtook sidewalks, vines climbed high on the sides of businesses, mold and dirt seeped into siding. I took it all in as I walked. I had everything I needed. I just needed to get to my destination. And to do that, I needed to be alert at all times. Passing through an old outlet mall, I kept to the shade from the storefronts, watching for signs of any threat in the remnants of the windows that hadn't been broken yet. The smallest crack of broken glass on concrete made me freeze in my steps. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe as I scanned my surroundings using the reflections around me and my peripheral vision. A louder crackle of glass had my muscles tightening in preparation for a fight. I broke my stance just enough to slowly turn my head toward the source of the sound, pulling my hunting knife from its sheath at my hip. An elongated shadow began to form from the doorway of a nearby shop only feet away from me. The shadow continued to grow. I took a slow and deliberate step backward, preparing to drop my duffel and run, or to fight for my life, whichever it came to in that moment. But it didn't come to either of those options. A wet, black nose poked out from the broken door. I could just make out the tip of a reddish-brown, freckled nose and a pointy ear that flopped over at the top. I didn't drop my stance, though. The dog's lips curled, and its yellowing teeth showed, but it didn't growl. Smart dog. Nothing that made noise lived long around here. I could take on a dog if I had to, but it would be easier for both of us if we could pass by without incident. I backed up a few steps, keeping an eye and an ear on my surroundings. It was a little dangerous, but I set down my duffel and ruffled through my bag, finding a jar of tuna. I opened it one-handed and scooted it towards the scarred-up little dog. Picking up my duffel bag and getting rearranged for the rest of my journey, I took several steps away and let the dog have room for its meal. We stared. I wasn't backing down, and neither was the dog. It took a few minutes, but the dog finally felt safe enough to stop baring its teeth and eat. When it came out, it was actually kind of cute through the scars that riddled its blocky face. Its ears were torn in places, and it was bony, but not completely starved. Taking a closer look, it was a boy. He was red and white under all the dirt and grime, and his tail was crooked. Scars littered his body like the graffiti on the walls of this very mall, garish and jarring to the eye, yet nature was reclaiming both, the hair already beginning to grow over some of the oldest ones on the pup. Nature always wins in the end. I took the opportunity, while the dog was distracted by food, to slink through the shadows and slip past him. He kept a watchful eye on me as I walked by and tensed, but didn't budge from his food. I continued on, scanning the area for threats, listening for any sound that could alert me to fight or run. Finally passing the last corner of the mall, I had to step out of the darkness and into the cloud-covered light. I tried to hide behind the few remaining broken-down cars in the parking lot as I made my way to my destination. The concrete parking lot ended, and as I stepped into the shade of a forested area, careful to avoid the crunch of leaves or the snap of branches as I stepped, a leaf floated to the ground from a tree, and out of the corner of my eye, I caught the terrifying flash of a shadow. I didn't have time to freeze. The movement was too fast. This was the time to fight. I whirled around, blade at the ready. In seconds, bag dropped. I methodically cleared the area by sight, left, right, behind me, above me, and there it was. About 30 yards away, behind me, hiding behind a sticker bush, I could see dirty red and white fur. The damn dog. Seriously? I whispered under my breath as the dog met my glare through the leaves. Clearly, feeding it wasn't the bypass I thought it would be. I put my knife away and, since I'd made a decent amount of noise, checked my surroundings again. Aside from the creepy mutt, all seemed well. Leaving my duffel bag where I dropped it, I walked towards him, arms flailing. Maybe I could scare him off? I don't have a lot of food, and it's hard enough feeding myself. I can't give him more. But the dog stood his ground until I was a few feet away, backing up rather than running. But he wasn't baring his teeth, so I turned around to get my bag, and the dog followed. I gave in and continued on to my destination with a dog.
Chapter 2.
Turns out, the dog wasn't that bad. He was a quiet companion, didn't ask for much, and just trotted a fair distance behind me most of the time. He even caught a mouse and ate it, which was disgusting, but at least he could fend for himself. I'd chosen a mild day for my travels, not that you could really predict the weather in Tennessee, but I couldn't stay in my home much longer. It wasn't safe. When quarantine began, my home was the perfect place to stay. We had a decent amount of food since Mom loved to can and had a huge garden full of vegetables and fruits, except broccoli. Mom and Nana both wouldn't touch the stuff. But as the virus spread and more people died, supplies became more and more scarce, and the government got too involved. The virus that they called silent death was just that. Silent. At first, you felt just a little more tired than normal. Then you were so thirsty and dehydrated. But by day 4, a rash appeared on your torso and your organs began to fail. By the time you knew you had it, you were already too far gone to save. The government locked the country down. People started to starve, unable to buy food and home supplies, so they raided stores, which just meant more outbreaks from police containing them. The death toll reached close to 900,000 when they finally released a vaccine. But that's when everything went so wrong. Testing of the vaccine was rushed and incomplete. It was sent out in mass batches given to children, the elderly, and most at risk first. Then it was sent across the world. The government was so hell-bent on making sure this vaccination got to as many people as possible that they released it in aerosolized form from aircraft over any city deemed either large enough or radical enough to deny the vaccine assistance. While there were some small side effects for a while, it seemed like things were getting better. Almost no new cases of silent death were reported for over a month, and people just had a cough or a red itchy rash from the sky drop. Things were okay. But that was when the test rats suddenly started showing signs of manic, psychotic breaks and attacking anything that came near them. Scientists tried to keep it quiet, but whistleblowers told the media. The world as we knew it completely panicked. Government officials confirmed the rumor, then immediately locked everyone down. Police patrolled neighborhoods 24/7 to ensure no one left their homes. And we were back to where we were. People began to starve, and the transformation began. The second people's anger took over, so did the vaccine reaction. It was nearly immediate. The hormones in their brain reacted, and they weren't people anymore. They were monsters. Ferals. If it moved, they attacked with savage ferocity, beating skulls in with anything they could reach, ripping off fingers with their teeth and tearing chunks of skin with their nails. The rage must have been adrenaline-fueled because both police and well-meaning citizens shot them, hit them with baseball bats, blasted them with tasers, and they didn't slow down until they were dead. But the biggest problem? The gunfire was a trigger. The well-meaning people trying to help the situation, as well as the officers, started attacking each other until, well, all that was left were the people hiding in quarantine. After a while, the vaccine made you nearly blind, but you could still hear. As far as I knew, it affected everyone, except me. My mom had been exposed to the vaccine while working in her garden and got into a fight with a guy from a few houses down months later when someone's car alarm went off. It sent anyone left in the neighborhood into a blind rage. My Nana, probably the reason I'm still alive, was killed in the fight too. Nana got the vaccine in the first round. She was elderly and had diabetes as well as asthma, so she was considered high risk and she got one of the first doses. The reason I'm still around? Mom was adamant about keeping the air and the house clean for her, and that meant air purifiers in every room. I can only guess that somehow the vaccine didn't reach me in the basement. Now, I'd eaten almost everything we had. More and more car alarms had been going off, and while most of the people, if you could call them that, were dead, the ones that weren't were deadly, and they weren't people anymore. Not really. They acted like crazed animals with the strength and skill of human hunters, but they wouldn't or couldn't speak. Sound set them off, and my house was not safe. My door's locked, but my house was old. Windows can easily be broken, doors can be busted in, and these things, these ferals, they'll happily break their own bones if it means they get to whatever set them off. So, I made a plan over the last few months, knowing this was coming. I learned how to be graceful and silent. I went one by one into my neighbors' homes, ignoring the decomposing bodies and collecting food, supplies, and any weapon I could find. Thank God for rednecks, because I found a house with quite the hoard and prayed I'd learn how to use them. I handled the knives as often as possible until they felt like they were an extension of my body, and learned how to take apart each of the guns piece by piece, putting them back together and doing this over and over again until I felt comfortable with them. But I still hadn't shot one. The guns were for if everything else went to shit. I prayed that day never came. Then I plotted. I needed a new place to call home, somewhere with good security, somewhere that I could try to hunt food or fish, but still be close to the city, and I'd need a water supply if ever something happened to the pipes. Initially, I'd thought about our middle school or the hospital, but eventually chose our local jail. It was small, but as long as I could find a set of keys to a cell, I'd have a safe place to lock myself into every night with water, and it had high fences around it as well, which made it more difficult for the ferals to get into. The jail also had a cafeteria and a small medical bay I could use if it wasn't raided already. As I took in my surroundings, the sky turned into a vivid orange sunset, and the jail came into view.
Chapter 3.
The blood orange sky melted into the green of the trees at the skyline, meeting the metal fencing of the jail. I'd planned for the possibility that there would be ferals here, but I hadn't expected this many. Usually in groups, they killed each other off almost immediately, one of them somehow setting off a chain of events until their bodies lay scattered in bloody meat pieces. How had one of them not rattled the fence or set off one of the guards' guns? There had to be more than 10 of them. How in the world was I going to get past that without bringing all the other ferals in the city this direction? The dog sniffed around a few paces behind me, still following, but he kept his distance from me. I sat down and went over my options, none of which could make a sound. I could try and knife each one of them through the fence, but that surely would rattle, and they wouldn't die fast enough. If I could manage to silently open the gate, I may be able to lure them out. But then what? An idea bloomed. The reason I'd chosen the jail was that the forested area around it and the creek nearby was a water source. The creek led to a decently sized body of water. Not a lake, but not really a pond either. Deep enough to drown if I could lure all of them into it. But how to lure them in without killing them in the process? I went through the contents of my backpack and my duffel, glad to be without the added weight. That's when I found the perfect remedy. Firecrackers. I had no idea when I'd picked these up, but I'm glad I did. Leaving my bags safely under some shrubs, I followed the fence line to the south, looking for a gate and praying I could open it quietly. The dog trotted behind warily. I found what I needed, a small gate that rolled open by remote control. I assumed the control panel was inside the guard shack just down the hill. I found it quickly, but the stench of rotting body hit me so hard I was sure I wasn't going to be able to stand it. Holding my breath, I ran inside, around the 2 rotting bodies on the floor, and started looking for a button. There were far too many, and as I was about to run out of breath when I thought I'd finally found the button, I let my breath out, pushed it, and ran out of the shack trying not to vomit. I was finally getting a hold of my stomach when the little dog made his way inside the shack and started sniffing at the bodies, and then he looked like he was going to eat one. I threw up as quietly as possible, then ran inside on shaking legs, grabbing the dog by its hips and pulling him out. He nipped at me at first, but I let him go as soon as I could close the door. Gross. I crept back up to the gate to see if it was open, seeing that I'd opened 2 of them. The ferals had crowded around them both. They must have made noise that I didn't hear during my panic, but they weren't raging, so I'd take the results I got. Lighter and firecrackers in hand, I headed silently towards the open body of water. I wished I had had something like a boat to float them on in the middle, but a flat piece of driftwood would have to do. I was running out of time and daylight. Arranging the firecrackers in the center of a decent amount of kindling I'd collected, I set the driftwood onto the water, lit the kindling on fire, and shoved it into the lake, hoping it would take a couple of minutes to go off. The dog had been following me dutifully all day, and for his sake, I prayed he'd keep following me now for his safety. In case they went off quicker than I expected, I hid silently off the path they should take and made myself as small as possible. And then I waited. and I waited. As I was beginning to think the fire went out, I stood up to check on it when all 4 firecrackers went off. For the first time all day, the dog freaking barked. It was just one bark. Maybe they wouldn't come this way. But I panicked and lunged onto the dog, who absolutely did not like being pinned down. But as much as he thrashed, he didn't bark again. I heard the telltale footsteps and rustle of leaves as ferals came bolting through. I froze. They hit the trees and branches as they ran blindly toward the sound, arms up, preparing their attack. I could see them now, bloody and dirt-covered, heading exactly toward my firecrackers. Finally, the stomping of running feet turned into splashing, and I knew they'd made it into the water. It felt like it took hours. The setting sun faded to night, and the moon rose, and finally, the splashing sounds stopped. Releasing the dog and letting loose my tense muscles, I held my favorite knife as I checked the path. It was clear. The dog followed as I carefully, slowly, painstakingly made my way back to the jail. Stopping to gather my bags, I found that the yard was clear. We made our way inside the yard, me and my wayward companion, and thankfully, one of the doors had been busted open so we could get inside. I turned the corner and nearly stopped breathing. This was not what I'd expected to find.
Chapter 4.
The jail was mostly empty, and it was clean. Too clean. The cells were empty. I'd expected to need to clean out bodies, but where did everyone go? There wasn't even a stench of decay. I found the guard room and pressed buttons until all the gates outside were closed. It took some trial and error. I passed through what must be the cafeteria and eventually found the cells. Open and clean. If I wanted to sleep tonight, I'd have to lock myself in, and I'd need keys for that. Looking through more doors and hallways, I eventually found what appeared to be a janitor's closet. Inside of it, on a hook, was a massive mess of keys. Hopefully this would work on one of the cells. And, hopefully, the dog knew to piss outside only. It wasn't like he was tame. I found the cells and tried key after key, eventually finding one that locked and unlocked. But getting the dog inside with me was a whole new task I hadn't anticipated. No one seemed to be around to hear, so I tried something new. "Come on, boy," I whispered, patting my leg. He just stared at me from outside the metal cell. "How about a name, huh? Would that make you trust me? Maybe some food?" I tried again. I tossed some jerky just inside the cell door, but he looked at me like he was too smart for that trick. "How about I call you Shadow?" He didn't budge. "What about Red?" His ears went back. "Okay, you don't like that one. Screw it. How about Larry?" Strangely enough, the dog seemed to like that and scooted inside. "Larry it is," I muttered, locking the door behind him through the bars. I laid down in the pathetic cot and was nearly asleep when I heard a voice. A real human voice. Larry the dog started to growl. I'd learned through the day that the little dog had great survival instincts overall, but he had the worst timing when it came to giving us away. I had my knife in my hand at the ready, but I'd already locked us in, leaving us at a serious disadvantage. I could go for a gun, but I didn't know how many more ferals may be around to hear it or what risk that could pose if I had to shoot. I could see the shadow of a man as he came into view. He was tall and lean with a scraggly beard, and he had a gun pointed directly at me. Without lowering it, he asked, "Who the hell are you?" It wasn't like I was in much of a place to fight, so I answered with the truth, Larry baring his teeth at the man. "My name is Alex. This is Larry. We came here for sanctuary believing it would be empty. Larry continued baring his teeth at the man, who finally lowered his weapon. Are you the reason all the ferals are gone from the yard? He said, holstering the gun and glaring at me. I wasn't sure if he was angry or happy about that, but I answered truthfully. Yes. My knife was still in my hand, but not in a fighting stance. Well, thanks for that, the man said sarcastically. Those were my best defense weapon here. My mouth opened in shock. You left them there on purpose? And why are you not one of them? I could ask you the same thing, he said, one eyebrow raised. I never got the vaccine. I'm not sure how I missed the airdrops, I confessed. But I'm not a feral, nor will I turn. I'm just looking for a safe place to stay. The man looked me and Larry up and down before deciding to give his truth. My name's Wyatt. I was here when the airdrops hit, but I never turned. I guess I must have missed 'em too. I was a security guard. My hackles raised. Just because he hadn't turned didn't mean he wouldn't. All right, Wyatt, if it's okay with you, I'd like to stay. Larry and I will be no problem. In fact, I can garden, and I know how to can. Wyatt took this into consideration. I have a small garden on the other side of the yard. Me and the others, we've built up a good thing here. Don't ruin it. We have rules. He lightly beat his palm on the bar. This cell is open. There are 3 of us. I'm not sure the others will let you stay, but you can talk to them in the morning. Keep the dog quiet. And then Wyatt walked off, presumably to tell the others of her existence. With my cell locked, my knife in my grip, and Larry as my lookout, I fell into a fitful sleep.
Chapter 5.
I woke up startled by Larry's low growl. Before I knew what was happening, I was on my feet, knife at the ready, prepared to take on the threat. But the threat was just Wyatt. And he'd brought food? Settle, pup. I have breakfast, he said as he slowly opened the door with what appeared to be the master key. Larry didn't attack, but he didn't stop baring his teeth either. Hush, Larry, I'll give you a bite, I said quietly to the dog, and surprisingly, he obeyed. So I tossed him a couple bites of fake eggs. Finish up, and I'll bring you to meet Bill and Jose. They're not super thrilled with you letting the ferals out, but I think they'll be okay with you staying if you can help with the garden, Wyatt said as I scarfed the food down. Between bites, I asked, why didn't either of them turn? In this world, there was no such thing as rude. Wyatt cleared his throat. Bill used to live out in the mountains and was too far away to be by the airdrops. Jose is like me, just never seemed affected. I nodded while I took my last bite, giving one more to Larry. Okay, well, let's go then. I didn't care if I looked and smelled disgusting. I needed to do this first. I walked out following Wyatt and Larry following behind me to the cafeteria I'd seen the day before. 2 men sat at a table, one probably in his 60s and the other in his mid-40s. Larry kept his distance. We said our hellos, and they both agreed that I could stay as long as I worked the garden, which they showed me to. It was on the opposite side of the jail, nestled between high fences with plenty of sunlight. They had tomatoes, cucumbers, broccoli, asparagus, and some strawberries they were doing their best with. I could easily grow this twice the size it was and yield so much more. I asked them where their gardening tools were, and they pointed me to a shed in the corner of the yard. I opened it, finding just about everything I'd need. I reached out to pull the hoe from its spot on the wall when the board holding it and the other tools gave way. The metal tools clanked and clamored as they hit themselves and the ground, and I froze in panic. This was the exact sound you didn't want to create, but I could not stay in place where the sound had happened. I quickly and quietly got out of the shed, closing the door and looking up to find several ferals coming at me from the other side of the fence. I bolted towards the jail, trying to make it inside, and ran headfirst into Jose. He'd probably ran to check on me, but it looked like Jose wasn't Jose anymore. His eyes had gone pitch black, and he was so tense his body felt like stone when I'd hit him. I didn't have time to react aside from backing up a step, but Larry did. Larry attached to his leg, giving me an opening as Jose swung his arms wildly at the red dog. I pulled my knife and plunged it into Jose's neck, but that didn't stop him. Adrenaline fueled his rage, and Larry let go with a whimper as he was kicked several feet away. I beelined to the door, beckoning Larry in with me as Jose gave chase. Strong arms pulled me inside the door as I heard the fence go down, pulling Jose's attention to the new sound. Larry and I barely made it in as Bill shoved the door shut and put his finger over his mouth in a shh motion. Out of breath and shaking in fear, I did my best not to make a sound as we made our way back to the cells where it was safest. Bill shut off the lights on his way, walking very quietly for a man of his size. I followed his lead, not knowing the jail as well as he did. We rounded the corner back to the cells, and I heard stomping footsteps. Running footsteps. Bill placed his hand on my arm, silently telling me to hold still and don't move. I pulled out my blood-soaked blade. The footsteps got closer and louder as they came closer, and thankfully, Larry shut up, hiding close behind me. I leaned against the wall where it was darkest, knowing if this was a feral, it may not be able to see me. I could still hear them fighting outside, but the one inside could hear it too and would be drawn to the noise and would have to pass right by us. Wyatt came around the corner in a huff, and Bill's body relaxed. But I didn't. Wyatt was running, and while I couldn't see very well, I could still see the telltale signs. His body was rigid, his arms up, and his breath was far more labored than it should be. Bill reached out to Wyatt, whispering to him, "Don't go out there." Jose turned. But the moment Bill's hand fully grasped Wyatt's arm, Wyatt went full feral. Bill was no match for him. Wyatt grasped Bill's arm and wrenched it nearly out of his body, pulling him to the ground. Bill screamed and his eyes met mine. I didn't move. Wyatt continued to punch and kick and bite Bill until I watched the life leave his eyes. I couldn't do anything about it but stand frozen in horror, praying that if I didn't move, didn't make a sound, that he wouldn't see me. Finally, after Bill stopped making noise and the life left him, the now totally feral Wyatt stood, listening to the sounds of beating happening from the garden. It felt like it took years. I held my breath, tears running down my cheeks, hoping against all odds that Larry wouldn't move either. But finally, Wyatt moved onto the garden. I waited until I heard silence before I locked every door, went to my cell, and cried.
Chapter 6.
When I woke up, Larry was asleep at my feet. This was the first time he touched me. He looked a little worse for wear, but he seemed okay. He'd saved my life. I found a shower stall and took a long shower to clean the grime and depression from my skin and my soul. I'd finally found people, and I'd lost them in less than a day. But I'd found a place that was mostly safe, and I'd found a new friend. He had 4 legs, and his name was Larry. I got clothes from my backpack, some canned chicken for my friend, and decided to check out the damage to what was now my garden. Larry walked with a slight limp behind me, but much closer than he ever had before. One panel of the fence was down, and 6 bodies lay scattered, bloody, and bruised on the ground around it. I dragged them to the edge of the forest, as far as I could, really, and attempted to patch the fence with wire ties from the shed. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold for now. A few plants had been trampled, but only 2 had been truly broken. With some love, they would come back to life. Larry laid down in the sunshine, as happy and relaxed as he'd ever looked as I pruned and gathered anything ready to pick. When I went back inside to the cafeteria, he followed me in. I found potatoes I could plant as well, and plenty of food stores to keep us going. I made us some dinner, and Larry finally allowed me to scratch his head, though he did bare his teeth a little. It was just me and him for the rest of our lives. I'd protect him, and he'd protect me, alone together to face the world.